Thanks for coming out to hear Will and Dave talk today. They've got a kind of a cool talk ahead for you. It'll touch a little bit on Beyond Earth and Beyond Earth Rising Tide, but when they pitched this talk to us at Firaxis, they said, we kind of want to give you some insight into how a Civ game gets made. And we were like, that sounds cool. And they're like, we think the people at Firaxicon will really like it. We were like, we also agree with this. So I'll let them come up. Ladies and gentlemen, Will Miller and Dave Mcdonough, co-lead designers of Sid Meier's Civilization Beyond Earth.
Thanks, Pete.
Okay, I'm Will. This is Dave. We're lead designers of Sid Meier's Civilization Beyond Earth and Rising Tide, the new expansion. And the topic of our talk here today is whose Civ is it anyway? This is going to be an interesting experiment and perhaps an unmitigated disaster.
It'll be funny, though.
But it'll be funny.
It'll be very funny.
So you guys will have a good time regardless. But as Pete said, we wanted to give you kind of a behind-the-scenes look at what our process is for designing a new Civ game. So we're going to do that on stage right now. We're going to design a new Civ game around a new idea, and we're going to do this with your help and the help of some special guests.
That's right. So we thought, what Civ game could we design? We just did science fiction in the future. What else? Where were we go next? Fantasy? What would we do? Let's go the other way totally. So we're going to design a Civ game about prehistory. What happened in the Stone Age, the time of legends, the myths, everything that happens before agriculture. So like a Civ game before a regular Civ game.
Right.
So in order to do that, we got to confront the basic question, the question that confronted us when we made Beyond Earth, which was, what really makes Civ Civ? What is the thing that this game has that it seemed to have had for the past 24 years that other 4X games don't quite have, that no other game that Firaxis made quite has? What is it that is at the heart of that Civ magic? What is the Civ identity? So for us, it started by examining what's the difference between a Civ game and another 4X game. Like, it's got all the X's, for sure. But there's this interesting blend of how it treats it, like how it treats the map, how it treats the short and the long-term decision-making, what kind of questions it puts to the players, and how willing it is really to make you think hard about who you are and what you want to do, and who those people on the other side of the map are and what they're trying to do, and how you're going to use this world, or how you're going to exploit it, or how you're going to save it, and stuff like that. So,
right, and I think at the heart of the Civ identity is the myth of civilization. So lots of Firaxis games use myth as the underpinning for the game's fiction. And we do this because you bring the myth, as a player, you bring the myth to the game. So if you think about our classic games, Civilization is sort of an elementary school understanding of history. That's the myth that you bring to that game. Or Sid Meier's Pirates, the idea of a pirate, we don't have to explain that to you. So in a game like Civ Prehistory, what are we going to call this game, Dave? Dawn of Civ?
yeah, Doc.
Doc?
Yeah.
Look, abbreviations are important. The forums will use them. Doc. All right, so in Dawn of Civ, what is the myth? I kind of see two variations of this. I see Clan of the Cave Bear on one hand, and Conan on the other hand. Where do we fall in this spectrum?
I like Conan.
I like Conan too.
So that's a great question. Classic Civ is, as we like to say, the elementary school textbook version of history, the very layman's knowledge. Sid likes to use the phrase, do your history research after you make the game, and we take that very seriously. We deliberately approach our games with a very stupid perspective in order to make them as we want the game to reinforce the things that everybody already knows about and already thinks are cool, because that's why you think the game is cool. The game never makes you feel dumb or makes you feel like you needed to learn more in order to appreciate it. So when we're talking about Stone Age times, what people tend to think of cavemen and mammoths and this huge pristine world full of 6-foot dragonflies and crazy things. And I really like the idea that the game's got a little bit of the mystical in it, that it's got a little bit of the myth. Part of what makes prehistory fascinating is because before we really appreciated why all of these things happened. We thought there was thunder because a thunder god made it, not because we understand physics. So I really think that ought to be in the game. We should have prehistory should be a little bit of the myth and legend and a little bit of the reality.
All right, so this is where you guys come into play. This is Pete over here with the mic. He's going to be walking around. What are other aspects of this myth that you would put in a Civilization game? Is there anybody out there that has
got a winner? Okay.
All right.
You can't have cities, can you?
Well, we're going
No
to get to
cities.
that.
All right.
So we'll get to growth in cities.
Creation of fire.
Yep,
Creation of
never-
fire.
Creation of fire. Victory condition, done.
Oh, actually, I was going to say fire too, but
Okay.
So,
stone
remember that.
tools.
All
or
right.
things- Okay, back here.
I want to be able to hunt and kill a woolly mammoth.
All right, yes.
Woolly mammoth.
I'm going to start writing this stuff down.
Very
Horses.
important.
Yeah, horses.
Horses, or the domestication thereof.
Got one up here.
Dealing with the elements.
Elements. Okay, so that kind of
Mammoths and
suggests
fire. This is off to a great start.
mammoths and fire. I want to play this game. All right.
Mammoths plus fire. Expansion.
Expansion, right? Right.
All right, so these are some kernels. We can roll with these. We'll bring them in as we go. So let's start talking about the pillars. Like, go through some of those X's or the Civ version of the X's and say, like, these are things that are in every Civ game that are usually a huge part of the game and that designers talk a lot about, that players talk a lot about, that are really important if and when they change from Civ to Civ. So we're going to start with exploration.
And I think before we get into this, it's important for us to say that, like, when we design Civ games, we don't generally think about the X's.
Right.
We think about the fantasy. What is it that the player does, and why do they do it, and how do we make mechanics to facilitate that? And that, like, I think 4X, the idea of a 4X game was imposed on what Civilization was after the fact. I don't know if, I mean, you can ask him, he's sitting up here, but I don't know if Sid came up with the X's first and then made the game. But it's all about the fantasy for us. So think in those terms.
These are more like the pillars, right? Yeah.
Right. So to help us out with exploration, we'll call to the stage Jake Solomon, lead designer on XCOM. Jake? Mike's up here.
It's right here. Please have a
So,
seat.
Said hot mic. Got a hot mic here. All right.
so Jake, people may not know this about you, Jake, but you spent a lot of time on Civ Rev.
I did. I spent a lot of time on Civ Rev. Yes.
Good game.
I was lukewarm. Look, I also worked on Civ. I started at the company on Civ 3, and then I also worked on Civ 4.
So you got more than enough Civ cred to earn that chair.
Sure. Yeah.
That wasn't the question.
Yes. Then of course I do. Yes.
So when we say exploration in Civ, that's often like one
Civ
of
is the
big
game
things.
with boats. It's the game with. It's the
Yeah.
planes game.
Right.
It's
No.
Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah.
What do you think about when you think about exploration in Civ?
Yeah, exploration. I think that's kind of the heart. For me, it's probably my favorite pillar because there's two sides to it. I think that as a player, there's something very, very powerful, both thematically and mechanically, about pushing back the darkness, right? I mean, it is that sense of possibility that all of the fog of war represents, that as a player, being able to push that back is very exciting, and it never, like that part never, ever, ever gets old, no matter how many thousands of games of Civs you play. And then I think the other aspect of that is that once you push back the darkness, it allows you to have both short-term decision-making. So as a player, you're like, which direction am I going? And then as you reveal something, you're like, oh, I'm going to follow this, or I'm going to dig into this natural feature. And then over a short period of time, you start building a medium and then long-term strategy when you're like, oh, man, I got to build my next city here. Oh, man, I'm up against this civ over here. And so the exploration part, it's very fun and exciting, and then it also is the foundation for the player. And the most part, to me, in strategy games is formulating a strategy, and then you get kicked off of your strategy that you formed and you develop a new one. But being able to form that strategy comes out of exploration. Being able to say, oh, okay, here's the lay of the land this time. Okay, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to build a city here, then I'm going to go here, and got to be careful about this leader over here.
So exploration is really the point at which a Civ game sets the stage.
Yeah.
It says, like, here's the world you're in. Look how beautiful and incredible it is. Also, look how dangerous it is.
Yep.
And it's where you decide who you are in the game and what kind of game you're going to play.
Yeah, that's where you set your initial thoughts, which invariably, at least for me, turn out to be wrong. But you have these initial thoughts of like, I know exactly how this is going to go. So, yeah.
And I guess in the context of a prehistory game, that darkness you mentioned is a very literal darkness, right?
Yeah.
Cave people were, pushing back the darkness with fire.
And that's, I think prehistory could be very exciting with exploration. Because, you'd have, I think that then, you can have like big humped things coming out of the fog, or you see like a giant dragon's back or something. Because again, this concept of there be dragons, prehistory game, there could actually be dragons.
So like, in addition to there just being a lot of space that you haven't seen that you have to explore, what makes exploration hard? Like, what's the obstacle there that we could put into prehistory Civ?
I suppose, I think that prehistory, I suppose the fact is that somebody could lose themselves if they wander off too far, right? And so I guess that kind of feeds in the idea of building up this concept of civilization. Like a prehistory game, I think you can't just come into it with this idea of civilization, but perhaps, you could put limits on the extent that you can explore would not be fun. But I think that having some sort of choice mechanic in there, I think would be pretty interesting. So maybe you could make it that you explore better in a certain pattern or around certain things, or once you establish the mythology of a certain area, maybe you can explore faster in that area.
Okay. Yeah,
It's interesting you say that the sort of you get lost idea. It almost seems to suggest like, what would it do to the game if we took away the map? The mini-map, I mean. Like if you
Sure.
really had to track your progress through the world by putting down markers or watching your footsteps even or something like that. You think that kind of thing goes too far? Would it be annoying to the player, or does it add something to the fantasy?
It'd be interesting to take something like that out of a Civ game. How would I feel? I think that if you push it as a mechanic, that could potentially work. I'm sitting here thinking like, man, you could definitely, when you're exploring, you could have different scales. Obviously, yes, the producers are immediately going like, what? But if you had different scales of the game to like in the exploration phase, like you're playing a mini, like the game you're playing for the first hour is one tile. It's like a single tile. And then it takes you, the next half of the game moves to like a circle of tiles. And then immediately you're like, okay, now we've uncovered some tech or built some civilization that allows us to range further. And so for me as a player, I would love that because pushing back the darkness is probably my favorite thing. So if you had two scales to the game where, okay, I have this map, and you can still have a mini-map, but it's only really for, in later stages of the game, it's one tile, and so the game sort of scales up as you play along. So
They could do.
That's a good back-of-the-box feature, scaling.
Yeah.
So you scale from the single campsite in the Sea of Darkness to
A little family group to
to a civilization,
a
on top of
tribe.
that.
Yeah. Wait a minute. I want this game idea now.
I'm just going to say for the record in the internet that at no point should anyone assume that we'll ever make a product even remotely like this. I'm going to disavow any future effort.
I don't know. I'm getting excited now.
What about
Scaling civilization. Okay. Yes.
what about that? Like you were talking about the uncertainty and seeing this hump that looks like a dragon.
Right.
One of the cool things about exploration to me is that like you go places and you think you know what's there, and when you leave, while you're gone, it changes and you have to come back.
Sure.
So what if we played on that a little bit? The world around you that you aren't actively looking at is kind of shifting in the seas. Like you don't totally understand it until you've got it nailed down.
Yeah.
So you can have these like big creatures or continents and things move in a way that is sort of extraordinary that no Civ game has done. That you have to have active sight on, or you have to like settle before it'll kind of stick.
That's interesting. So so you get this again that would give you a sort of sense of scaling exploration where again you still I think it would be great because what that allow you to do I guess is to have more exploration throughout the game where it never gets kind of old until a certain point borders are set or enough or you have a certain tech. I think that'd be awesome.
That's kind of one of the interesting problems with Civ late game or mid game is once you've kind of explored the whole map, the map becomes much less interesting. You don't have the exploration to kind of pull you through. And to have the landscape sort of shift underneath you almost if you're not careful or if you don't have sight would be pretty cool, I think.
It also reinforces a sort of power relationship. Like in Civ, you take over the world because you're humankind and you have that power. But in pre-Civ, you're pretty weak relative to the world. The world is a pretty big, impressive, dangerous place. This is actually something we thought a lot about on Beyond Earth. We wanted the alien planet to be dangerous, and you don't belong there.
Right.
You got to work hard to belong there. So maybe, like, and that's sort of a similar arc could be going on in this game. Like, by the time we've figured out fire, agriculture, and writing, we're ready to take over the world. But before that, the world could, like, squish us at any point.
That's right.
And so, like, this is a very real way of representing that, to have the world be this almost living thing. Like, the land is a living thing that is, like, got its own agenda, and you're kind of riding it.
And then you zoom out, and you realize you were only a small tribe of barbarians in a game of Civ, And then somebody comes in with tanks and just crushes you. and that's how it ends.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we'll Thank
I
you.
should end on that one.
Thanks very much for coming up. Ladies and gentlemen, Jake Solomon. All right, moving on.
Okay,
Step 2.
step 2, how does our civilization grow? So growth is, I guess, the expand X and the exploit X kind of rolled all
Build.
in one. The build.
Put roads on everything.
Right. Growth is a pretty big topic, but how does the idea of growth change when somebody suggested out in the audience when we don't have a city anymore, or when our cities are movable, or
Before we developed any kind of architecture.
right before we developed any kind of architecture. So I guess the first thing we should talk about are what are the constraints to growth. So we'll get Pete back in the audience here.
Where is he?
Think about in prehistory, what were the constraints to growth?
Various families coming together instead of just a single family group.
Oh, so a lot much more intimate focus where you're like at the personal tribe level.
Well, back then there were no maps. So, like you were saying about the map, all the darkness could creep back. That, as you lose sight of things, you lose what you had there.
Yeah, okay, I
Right.
like that. Sounds good.
I was going to say the change of the seasons would definitely affect on what pops up as resources on the map.
So that suggests a different time scale. We'll talk about that in a minute.
One turn in a Civ game is a year. We couldn't have to change that.
I would think like fear and understanding of the world could be a potential mechanic.
Fear is a mechanic, okay?
I would say migratory herds or food sources or resources that move around you would have to follow.
That's a great
I
idea.
think let's call it there. That's a good set. So I like that, the idea of those like animals. Like I like that the world is full of big living things that are scary and dangerous. But eventually you're going to learn how to hunt them, and then they're going to be food.
Right.
That's a good story. So
And
the mammoths. With mammoths at the top of our list.
Already. So another key factor in growth in prehistory was the invention of agriculture. So if you think about what agriculture is represented as in Civilization game, it's building improvements on things, or it's mastering the land. So we've pushed back the darkness, now we master the land.
Mm-hmm.
What are the ways in which a prehistory society would do this? Like what would take the place of improvements or of a worker or that part of the game?
I think, to me, in my mind, it sounds like what I would call like tradition or ritual. Like if you're a nomadic civ and you're chasing the bison around, you don't need to improve things, but you develop this mythology, this ritual around the bison and you and your symbiotic relationship. And you know the landscape you travel every season, your children are raised to understand this cycle. They like revere the bison and so on. So what if it was like that? Like you have landscape that's like wild, and as you move around, if you traverse sort of common paths or if you follow a certain species of creature, those become tame or safe for your civ, and you can dwell there, you can grow up there. It's not so you can move. You don't have to settle down in the sense that you have to build on a single tile, but you're sort of like kind of sweeping the ground and scrubbing it in a way, in order to make it safe ground and not dangerous ground.
And that kind of dovetails with cities that can, or I guess not cities really. It's your tribe, right?
Yeah.
You have a tribe that's moving to follow the elements. I think that having elements not be a fixed entity on the map, or at least in the beginning of the game, you follow the caribou, you follow the bison,
Right.
And also that's going to, I think, work interestingly into the combat system too. I guess we'll talk a little bit about that later. But if you have to kill the thing you eat, that's food, right? You hunt and you gather. Gathering is a great impetus for exploration. Hunting is a great impetus for combat. Those could drive your growth. Food is sort of the driver for growth in Civ currently. The more you eat, the more population you get, the bigger your city gets. So that could be a much more active participation, or active thing that you do in the game. You make the land safe, you hunt for food, your civilization grows.
It just occurred to me that nobody might be able to read this except for us.
Can anybody read this? Doesn't matter.
Well, it's for our own reference later. Don't worry about it. All right, so you have like this wilderness that's shifting around you, and wherever you send your tribe, the places you go, those are places you're making safe or known. And animals are like units in themselves, and they sweep around, and you can hunt and kill them for your food. The more you do that, the more you understand them, and you can do it better, or you can predict their movements and so on. What's the goal here? The goal is ultimately to get to the point of a city, right? Like, we're trying to arrive at the first turn of regular Civ, which is first city.
Right.
So that is agriculture. So maybe along the way you are developing agriculture, and you can leave camps or you can leave family groups in certain places that are eventually going to settle down and dwell.
Right.
Maybe at like the intersection of migratory patterns, like the Okavango or Fertile Crescent. You know, we're going to park here because animals come by all the time. We're going to suck up food from them until we figure out how to not need them anymore. Figure out how to do agriculture.
So you know this question's coming, Dave. Sid, you know it's coming too. You've made this distinction between safe and unsafe. What does the UI look like for this? So UI is sort of the way the game works. And even at this early stage, we're already thinking about how we will interact with the game, what the handles are, how it's going to look. And we have already got some pretty complex state on the map in Civ currently. So we've got black fog, gray fog, white fog. We're going to need to add more information to the map to represent this safe, unsafe idea. How do we do that?
Well, I mean, the first thing I see is actually a literal art style difference. Like, the wild land looks wild. Like, the shapes are jagged, and maybe their shader is different. They're, like, dark and swirly. And the animals in them look kind of evil. And then tame land is like Civ. It looks green and fertile and pleasant and welcoming.
Okay. Andrew, we've got budget for 2 art styles, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Think of it as one art style with 2 modes.
No. Done next week.
So, all right, so this is our growth. Really, what we're growing is not so much our improvement infrastructure, but our ability to exist safely on the land.
Right.
Really, the tribe is growing. We're kind of like, we're scrubbing land into safe land. We're learning the patterns of the moving animals and the nature of the plants or whatever, with a view to eventually domesticate/agriculture them.
Sounds good. All right.
Moving on.
Moving on. Up next, our favorite, fighting, combat. To help us with combat, we're going to call up Dennis Shirk. Dennis is the franchise producer for Civ. He was the producer on Civ 5 and other things, Beyond Earth in addition.
A greater expert in civilization there may not be, short of Sid himself.
Right.
And just for reference, all of these ideas are property of Firaxis Games.
You will not go in the credits.
Just so everybody knows.
So Dennis, talk to us a little bit about your experience with civilization in the context of combat and units. So these are the pieces you have on the board. We put a lot of effort into their art. What is their main function in the game?
Well, at least from my experience, I'm not a game designer. This all comes down to adding a level of stress to the game. You've got this situation where you're exploring and you're expanding and exploiting, and there's nothing really to check that except maybe other decisions that the AI is making, the order in which they might be researching or building things. But there's nothing to stop you from just going to town and doing exactly what you want, when you want it, where you want it. And combat provides that wild card of sorts. They're the things that you can't necessarily plan for. They're the barbarians that show up on your doorstep and start burning down your fields. They're the AI player that's mad at you for settling too close that suddenly puts together a rather large army and goes rampaging across, takes out, burns down your science research city. It's that kind of pressure that without that, I don't think it's as compelling a game. I normally play a very builder-oriented game. That's how I play Civ. My favorite one is just going for the culture victory. And with Brave New World, with introducing the great works, that's how I like to play. So I never maintain like these huge standing armies, but I always have to maintain just enough because things will happen, and you got to kind of prepare for that. It takes you out of your comfort zone in terms of doing exactly what you want to do because the real world is full of surprises, and that's where this really shines.
That's really good insight. My favorite way to play is to conquer the person who's going for the culture victory. I was kidding.
Right. So thinking about that, where's Pete? Thinking about that,
combat.
What are the things you fight? What do cavemen
and how does
cavemen
fighting work? Like,
right.
We're imagining we've got a smaller tribe with maybe more individuals rather than like big armies.
I was thinking more along lines of to have a soldier, developed. You would have them send out to the wild to compete, for a trophy to bring back, so that they could be a soldier in the standard.
So
more elaborate.
So things coming out of combat to make the soldier better. That's good.
That's interesting. Like XP and veterancy is a really big deal.
Yep.
How about other subspecies of humans?
So that's the clan of the cave bear, right? You got the Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens, and they have different attributes and are vying for control of the land. That's a good option.
Although putting on my producer hat for a moment, I'm sure players would say, I want to be able to play as the Neanderthals, and that means 4 alternative play modes.
Right.
Vicious animals and indigenous wildlife that's not exactly friendly, like maybe vicious mammoths.
Dinosaurs.
Mammoths at the top of our list.
Right, mammoths. So just to pause and elaborate on that for a second, one of the other functions of combat that is kind of interesting is that it provides an early game kind of attaboy almost. Like the first barbarians you encounter, you sort of roll over, and it feels awesome. So maybe conquering the wild animals, or maybe not the mammoths, but the pack of wolves or whatever is sort of serves that same function.
Mythic quests and spirit journeys for warriors, things like that.
Oh, I like. If we were embracing a little bit of the legendary in this game, we could go for like
instead of
big beasts.
Oh.
We'll get to technology later.
A little more toward the late game, because these early cultures actually didn't lose a lot of people to battles because you couldn't survive. There was a lot of intimidation. You could have a mystical power over someone else. You could use fire. They don't have fire, so they back down. Or you win and then you intermarry and take over their tribe.
So we don't have a diplomacy slide in here.
Well, I
but
think
that sounds like a good
I think that's enough to move on for now.
Yeah.
So, so we've already established that the world is a dangerous place, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're going to do that versus the wild beast things really well. Like I actually really like the idea that they're the same as the ones you need to eat, and like they're like those mammoths or the bison could totally kill your guys early game until you figure out the right tools or the right hunting techniques, and then the tables turn and they become food sources.
I think we're always looking for opportunities to overlap systems like this.
It's a good interplay.
If we overlap combat with combat with growth, because you kill the food that you eat, that's a good synergy.
That's an interesting. You mentioned talking about the tech tree a little bit later, but it brings something into play when you're talking about just prehistory, what that might look like, and that would be a fun exploration in terms of even just your units. I mean, if we're going from nothing at all or punching to clubs, and that's the space of time that we have. Or maybe we go to the spear. What does everything in between look like? Are you going from punching and the next thing you research is rock in hand? There's a lot of opportunities.
I can just see the icon now.
Yeah. You're riding, before you ever have a chance to get to horseback riding, or you're riding around on cows or bison or something like that.
Wait, who's riding a cow?
It would be, I'm just saying, it could be very cool. Pigs, very small people.
Very
Depends
small
on the size of your tribe.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
dwarf
opportunities for something like that. I still think that eventually you have to ride around on a dinosaur at some point, but maybe that could be a mod. I've always wanted to see that in a Civ game.
That sounds like it should
I know
be
that
a
would
mod.
split the fan community right down the middle, with half that absolutely think it's the worst idea in the world, and the other half is like, yes, we need more GDRs.
So a question that constantly faces Civ designers is that you can't please everybody, and most of the time you're not going to please anybody.
Right. So you improve your military in two different ways in Civ. You sort of improve them at the high level. A whole class of military gets better through tech progression, but also the individual units get better through promotion. And I think it would be neat in this game to sort of flip the emphasis. So like in XCOM, you become very attached to your soldiers because you have fewer of them and they have more personality until they get killed.
Then you're still attached to them.
But then you're still attached to them. There's
in a
sort of this
sad way.
emotional connection. So maybe if we're dealing with a tribe of people as opposed to armies of people, we could swap those around. What do you think?
I don't know. It seems like if we're dealing down the tribe level, that you might end up getting a little too attached to them, especially if this is George, my son, the caveman, and he's going off to battle and he's going to die eventually.
Would you have George the Second and George the Third?
It's an interesting question of scale, though.
George
Because when you're producing in a typical Civ game, when you're starting at dawn of actual civilization, you can create armies and armies and armies and send them forth. And if we're talking prehistory and you're talking about a much smaller scale, how do you keep that scale feeling small? Because you're not going to explore the world because it's prehistory. So it'd be interesting to see how you treat those units so they still feel like it's part of the tribe. It's important to keep them alive. I don't know, in that aspect, maybe the XCOM approach feels a little bit more interesting, where when they do die, it means a lot more because they're not out farming and getting food later.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I think that Civ operates on bizarre abstractions. The fact that your leader, like George Washington, lives for 1,000 years, it's a little weird, right? Or that a unit is the size of a mountain on the map. We sort of deal in abstractions whenever, and I think to make that mechanic work, we would have to introduce a new one, which is to say these military units have names and they live, for a while, unless the time scale were to adjust to accommodate,
I like that they live for a while. I'm intrigued by the suggestion of like these legendary characters. And in my mind, like you could take all of these and wrap them up into a mode where your military units are like a hero character with his warband. And like it's very important who that guy is, because that governs like how his army, his little warband fights. And they've got to go out and prove themselves to get better. Like it's mostly a sort of an experiential progress and less about technology. And then if he gets killed, maybe we can like save the player at that point and say he's not killed but wounded. He comes back to the camp. And now he's like, crusty old guy in the camp telling the young warriors how to fight. And he's still alive. You don't have to like go through the emotional heartache. There was risk in the fact that now you lost him on the battlefield, but he can still contribute to your civ, and you're sort of reinforcing this idea that the tribe is a group of individuals that are alive and that have the story together. What about that?
That's a really interesting approach. It's my gut is that would take a really interesting and unique design approach to make that balance out with the scope of time. And if you're passing time, would that still work? Would it pull you out of the game a little bit too much to have you that attached or have stuff continue like that?
I guess that's where
a
the
tricky
time scale
question.
comes in.
Yeah, I mean, if every turn is a year, then it becomes plausible. But then, you can't, 300 years, I guess, enough time would have passed to hit those historical markers and to meet the fantasy there.
Right.
And other games have solved this in interesting ways. If you think about, what's the Double Fine?
Massive Chalice.
Massive Chalice, thank you. If you think about Massive Chalice, like those heroes, they retire and then they have kids. And there's Rogue Legacy too. I don't know if any of you guys have played that, same deal. So there's some interesting ways to work around that. But I think giving these units on the map personality and attachment is a powerful force and really sort of emphasizes the things we would want to emphasize here.
I'd also like to point out that what you're witnessing is actually a very common move for Civ designers, and all Firaxis designers. I think Jake mentioned the same thing. We have a system that we like the sound of. We have a gameplay that we like the sound of. We want to say, this is going to be fun for players to use. And now we're trying to find a way to fit the fiction of the game to it. So the gameplay came first, and now we're trying to make it work with the story. And that's how we tend to approach these games. Like, we're very much about gameplay first at Firaxis. It's very much why I think Civ games are the way they are and why it's such a venerable and successful franchise. We think about what you do, not what we're telling you it means. But, we can't do without both, but it is in this order. So,
I think it's certainly, most of the time it's it's gameplay, but that is also influenced by the fantasy. I think that we want to put the player in a role and have them do interesting things. And mechanics come from fantasy, but they're also, it works the other way too.
And it doesn't have to be locked like that. We often have designs, especially if you're talking down a path like that where you have somebody who stays alive. We'll often have that. We try it out in game, have people playing it, because until we play it, we're not sure if it's going to be fun. So stuff doesn't have to just exist at a written design document layer, and then it's going in, and that's that.
Right.
All right. I like the sound of this. I think that's going to serve the role in this Civ game that it does in other Civ games.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks, Dennis. All right, moving on.
All right, so we've done exploration, we've done growth, now we've done combat. I think the next step is
it's about the future.
It's about the future. What is the backbone of progression? The main way that we gauge our distance from the end. How we negotiate the game.
And what is the most long-term of the long-term strategy?
Which would have to be technology and culture. So every Civ game has had some kind of tech progression. Starting from Civ 1, we had sort of a tech tree. It was always a tree until Beyond Earth when it was a web. But you made these decisions, these sort of high-level, long-term decisions, long-term investments that guided your civilization, guided your culture through the game. And it's a great barometer for how well you're doing, where I am, what era I'm in.
It's also some of the most fun parts of the myth. Like, it's romantic to look down the tech tree and see gunpowder, or see metallurgy, or see rocketry. It's romantic to look at the civics and see, like fundamentalism or like communism. Be like, oh, what would we like to play as that? Because we know what those mean. But we also know that they're big, grand ideas. So it's fun to work towards them and then like take on the mantle and live it for a while. So they're very evocative. They're one of the most resonant parts of the game, the scientific and cultural ideas. So this is where like the game gets really philosophical. And it's also why almost always these have been really heavily abstracted. Like, it's a lot of menus. It doesn't exist on the map the way mammoths and fire and warriors can the same way. It's really got to exist in the mind of the player. And so it's a very tricky system or subset of the game to design, but all the more important to get right. And in order to do that, we're going to ask Anton Stranger, a designer extraordinaire on Civilization V's expansions and Beyond Earth, to join us.
Hello.
So Anton, you designed the World Congress and League system in Civ 5,
for Civ 5.
and you designed the virtues in Beyond Earth. So when we say technology, culture, and progress in prehistory, what do you think about?
Yeah, technology and culture in prehistory.
Or
kind of like you
in
said.
Civ, sorry.
In
Civ
Civ
first, and then
too.
we'll get to prehistory. Sorry.
Yeah, so I guess more generally, to me, you guys have talked a lot about myth, and I totally agree. I think technology and culture are kind of like the most closely linked pillar to the myth of the game. And Civ is always this really nice balance of there are parts that are procedural and random and different every time, and the player tells their own story. And there are other parts where there's similar things every time, and you can kind of rely on a sort of common thread underneath all of your playthroughs. And I think technology and culture are that second thing. So the technology and the culture are traditionally the least on the map of all the pillars, but they also set the rules for the game in a way that's pretty fundamental and far-reaching. And they kind of, in my mind, the definition is kind of like they define what is possible and when it is possible.
So thinking about culture and technology in prehistory, what are some of the things that we would need to learn? How would we learn them? Pete. Go Pete.
Pete, run faster.
So back then they thought they needed to sacrifice goats or do a dance to like get it to rain or get victory in battle.
Ceremony,
what if that's
ritual.
actually how it worked? Like you needed to sacrifice to X god to.
Yeah,
Sure,
so religion,
okay.
superstition, these things play a much bigger role.
Customs, depending on how the culture grows.
Okay.
Timekeeping. How
Interesting.
How
yeah,
do
okay.
you measure time? And sorry, that could lead into a thought of what if, as the game progressed, the length of time that a turn encompassed changed.
Yeah,
well, it already
just
kind of
to-
does that. I mean, there's time dilation.
Yeah, a quick aside,
in
yeah.
Civ already, but that driving it by discovery of clocks is pretty cool. I like that.
I like that.
Handicaps, because if you develop the spear, you're going to be less likely to want to develop like the bow. So you're going to have where one technology makes
So-
other technologies harder
so
or
some
impossible
exclusivity,
to get.
yeah.
Taking on some style, like we're the horsebowmen or we're the spearmen.
I feel like in prehistory there would be no like language or communication. Would communication be
Language is
important?
huge.
Language, yep.
Even before agriculture, that was one of the foundational things that makes us human.
In the specific cultures, maybe this your tribe deals with warriors better, so the warriors improve, or maybe they deal with bison more, and so they worship the bison, and bison give them more food, or they deal with gatherers more, so the gatherers are able to produce more food, and whatever your tribe happens to worship or looks up to.
So specialization. So I think that's good. One of the great things that the technology progression does in a Civ game is unlock new possibilities. It's like an ever increasing possibility space. So with some of these suggestions like timekeeping, I think timekeeping is a really good example.
I like the religion
and religion
ritual one.
What are
pushing back the darkness.
Pushing
too.
back the darkness. Like what are the mechanical things that these technologies unlock? So when I learn how to tell time or how the sun moves or calendar or whatever, what does that let me do in the game?
Right. So I think timekeeping, for example, could let you, I guess, be more measured and more methodical about moving around the map. You could maybe plan your people to say, okay, go out here and hunt these mammoths, but come back.
It would probably lead to the earliest beginnings of agriculture. You can understand
Yeah.
how long crops need
And
to
the seasons.
germinate and stuff like that.
And I think the whole sort of like wild areas, untamed areas versus tamed areas is something that you could kind of slowly do with whatever technology is in the prehistory game. And so like you kind of learn, okay, well, these are kind of the dangers of this desert region. And I understand them now. I've hunted animals here. There's this sort of tribal knowledge that's passed down, this culture, this identity that we've built. And that allows me mechanically as a player with my group, my tribe, to sort of tame this land and make it my own.
So this taming thing we've got in terms of growth, technology is enabling that, but it's a linked cycle. So the growth, the more time you spend in a region, the more you can research it, so to speak.
Yeah.
The more you research it, the better you are there. So it's reinforcing.
Yeah, so there could be a tribe, and maybe this is sort of a wide versus tall play style thing where you have a tribe and you stay in the desert the whole game, and you really milk those bonuses and become experts at that. And maybe that's how you win. Or you kind of are a roving band. You track different migratory patterns of animals, which I think is also a really cool mechanic, across different biomes. And you kind of get a little bit of everything or have a more diverse tech path. I think definitely technology someone had mentioned an idea earlier about the migratory patterns. Being able to predict those, I think, is really cool. Because maybe you start out at the beginning of the game and like, oh, okay, they moved 3 tiles, but they went into the darkness. Do I follow them? Is it dangerous there? But then eventually you've hunted them enough, or you have enough technology that you're like, okay, well, I know that they're going here. I can see that even though I haven't explored that area there yet, or even though I haven't explored it in a while. I kind of know that about the map, even though I can't see it right now.
I really like the idea of language gating lots of different things. I think
certainly interactions with other players.
Right, maybe but the first time you meet another player in the game and you haven't researched language, all you can do is kill them.
Oh, well.
you know, after you learn to speak.
Then you learn how to kill them in different ways,
right,
which communicates different things.
But that has the seeds of some sort of diplomatic interaction or economic interaction.
Yeah.
Also governments. So, you know, thinking about World Congress, which you designed, language gating some sort of government that you can impose on your own civilization is an interesting idea too.
We're going to invent the concept of king.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the big parts that at the beginning of a traditional Civ game is kind of taken for granted is, you have this government, you have this organization that's already set up. You have this cultural identity. In prehistory Civ, I think it's fun to not have that yet, and language could be a big part of that, to leading your government. I think in addition to language and agriculture, another big pillar for me for prehistorical humans becoming civilizations was kind of diversification of labor, and that's really what agriculture allowed. So, like, when we're a tribe, we all have to go hunt and gather in our own ways. And maybe we have roles or specialties, but once we sort of settle down and figure out, okay, well, like, you can write stuff down and devote your life to that because it's really hard and we don't have a fax machine or a copy machine. And you can go hunt because you're really good at that, and you can make the advanced weapons for hunting because that's really hard. You can't just pick up a stick. Now we know what swords are, that sort of thing.
It also works really well, talking to Dennis earlier, works really well with the idea that your units are more personal.
Yeah,
they're more
exactly.
specialized. So
It's
just
like
how
you
have,
are a blacksmith.
Right, you have specialized cities in civilization now. Perhaps
do.
you have specialized units in...
Banding them together is the tribe.
Right, and that identity could be linked to them or their family, for multiple turns across generations.
Looking at the civics screenshot, I'm now imagining, like, the first one is guy who is biggest, guy who is smartest.
Big man history.
Biggest and smartest guy together. Like, that's our progress.
So
what about the, we were talking a little bit about the animals and, like, the things that you fight and how like the world is full of dangers that you eventually make into resources.
Yeah.
We haven't talked a lot about resources, but I think we were sort of assuming that there are things like animals and plants that you domesticate or learn how to grow.
Right.
So, but like, technology is usually what governs that. Like, if I can't kill the mammoth now, how do I learn how to do that?
Right, yeah. So I mentioned earlier that technology is kind of like off the map in a way that the other pillars aren't. But there's definitely overlap, like you guys say. Like, we try to overlap our systems, and that leads to a lot of rich interactions. So, in a traditional Civ game, you have technology sort of reveals resources or allows you to use them in a way that you hadn't before. And I think that would work here as well. Like, there are things out on the map. There are mammoths. You start out the game and your people don't know, like, is this do they eat grass? Do they eat people? Like, are they going to hurt me? Are they just very docile?
Well, I think that Dave's sort of getting at the implement too.
Yeah.
Like, how do we
tool making?
Tool making is like a huge part of prehistory civilization, and perhaps the entire.
That could be. It's basically like the agriculture of this game.
Right.
The first tech is I can make a tool. And then what do I make it out of? What is it for? How specialized is it? How sophisticated is it?
Yeah, someone had mentioned stone clubs in one of the first idea gathering sessions. And when I first heard the theme a very short time ago, when I was thinking of technology, the first thing that came to mind was tools. Because that was really, there weren't, as you have in Civ, traditional Civ on turn one, you don't have like a group of scientists producing beakers in a lab in prehistory. You don't really in actual history either, but it's an abstraction. But like,
that's not how science works.
Yeah, what is science in prehistory? It's practical use of things immediately in front of you. Like, there wasn't this long view. There were these mythologies, there were these religions, but it was about what is the tool I can use, and that was another pillar of what makes civilization is the opposable
We also have
foe.
a neat opportunity there to overlap what you're finding on the map with what's happening in the tech tree. So
Totally.
If you find that stone that you can nap into an axe. That's your research, that's your progress.
Yeah, you don't kind of like conceptualize an axe in the abstract. You see something there and you're like, what if that and that were together?
So one of David's
Minecraft level of technology.
David's favorite games in the entire world is Colonization.
Yes.
David loves Colonization, the original, like not the Civ 4 version, but
still play it.
The original Colonization is one of Dave's favorite games. And that game, the unit that you had was entirely about the tool that they possessed. And the
Well,
tool
the
was
military
the thing
unit.
that, the military unit, right? And the tool is the thing that you made from simpler parts, which I always thought was a very elegant solution. And you could give several tools to a unit, and as they took damage or whatever, they would lose them, gradually becoming less and less effective.
Yeah.
So that circle is really neat. Find something on the map, improve it into a tool using research, science, put it on a guy, make the guy better,
Yeah.
repeat.
It operates more like a holistic buff. Like, this is my tribe warband.
Mm-hmm.
This is my tribe warband plus stone. This is my tribe warband plus stone and bows. Like those are like tiers of power that would be commensurate roughly to like spearmen, swordsmen, knights, tanks.
At the same time, though, like I really liked that mechanic too. I haven't played colonization as much as you have, but
Nobody has.
we
Nobody
talked.
has.
It is impossible. But at the same time, we've talked earlier about having this sort of like time of heroes and legends, and if we're not careful, if Civ Prehistory, Dawn of Civ, Doc becomes a story of like, okay, well, I have people and I give them tools, it might become about the tools and where they are as opposed to the people. So it'd be an interesting balance to find out.
I think what we're saying is that you characterize tech progression or military progression as like in equipment terms.
Yes.
Like I have my warriors who know how to warrior, but this time they're armed with bones, and this time they're armed with iron-tipped spears, and that's the difference for me.
Yeah.
Well, so one of Anton's favorite games is Final Fantasy Tactics.
This is
Anton
true.
loves Tactics. And the character progression in Tactics is entirely about equipment. Well, not entirely, but it's like you've got your guy who has persistence and personality, but it's the equipment you put on the guy that really...
And the job that they have.
And the job that
so
they
you
have,
sort of pick
right.
a role for them, and they definitely, some are suited for one better than another. And
Right, so I think
there's
there
that
are
persistence
ways that
between
you can
battles.
reconcile, and XCOM
It
does
is.
this very well too, where
Yeah.
you reconcile the investment you put into equipment and the investment you put into the people, which unfortunately, have attrition sometimes, they die.
Yeah.
And finding that balance is very important.
But also, I mean, in Civ though, we can use this to gate all of the things you do. So like equipment could also be how well you can erect a camp, or what you can do with the land that it's on, or how tame you can really make this place.
Yeah.
Or what you can do in this region that your tribe has grown up in that you understand really well. Like if I'm that desert tribe, I know where to find water. At the start of the game, I can only find it in oases, which maybe I know exactly where they all are. But later on, if I got better tools, I also know how to dig for it.
Yeah,
And
like a well.
now I have the capability to dig for it, so I'm even better in the desert. And eventually, you get to the point where you can set up that city, and we've now arrived at regular civilization.
And God help the person that tries to invade you in the desert, because that is your land. And
Right.
will totally mess
Got
them
all
up.
these superstitions. The Ifrits and Jinns will come and burn their souls.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good sort of survey of progression here. Thank you, Anton,
Thanks, Anton.
for your help.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, so in conclusion.
Coming down. So at this point, this would have been like, I don't know, an afternoon's worth of work to just throw ideas around like this. And there's a lot more of these that will now occur. If this was a real game that we were really making, or we're talking about how Beyond Earth was made, this continues many, 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 many times over, where we think very, very deeply and critically, but also at a very high level, very sort of philosophically, about every move that's going to be made in the game and what it really means, not just what the player is going to do, but how it expresses Civ as opposed to another game, how it's going to work with all the other systems, what synergies are going to be there, what is going to be lost if we're abandoning tried and true mechanics from past Civ games. Like if we take on this warbands idea and now we don't have armies anymore, how does that change the way military feels? Is it more fun to have the old way or the new way? Civ is a game that exists on a continuum. They're never just made in isolation. But this is a little bit of the thought process of like what it feels like to sit down and contemplate how do you make a new game of Civ, a game that belongs to the Civ franchise but is at the same time new.
So, how did we do? Let's bring up an expert to pass judgment on this whole exercise. Sid Meier,
Sid
ladies
Meier,
and
please.
gentlemen. So Sid, you have some experience with civilization.
I've been working on a little prototype over there. So
is it already done?
No, this is really fun and really cool. A couple things come to my mind. Actually, as I'm listening, I am designing a prototype in my mind. It's kind of like, what are the tricky things that we would deal with first? I think when we're prototyping, there's a lot of stuff we know we can do, but there's always some new things that we're kind of unsure of that we kind of go to first. And that's kind of what went through my mind listening to these ideas. One of the things that I think we try to do is to put you in the coolest role in this world. Like, who's having the most fun in this world? I think that's a question that comes up here. You know, in Pirates, you're the captain of the pirate ship. That's the coolest person in that world. You know, in Civ, you get to manage the civilization. You get to make all these decisions. Here, it's not quite as clear to me who's having the fun, you know? Is it that Conan person, you know, in that unit that's really having the fun? I think we would need to work to make the role that you have, this kind of overlord of this world, where the cool fun happens. I think that would be one challenge, I think, in putting a prototype like this together. Another kind of pillar of Civ in my mind is this idea of multiple kind of simple, accessible systems working together to create an interesting complexity and the interaction between systems. And that kind of is borne out in Civ when you've got one guy over here exploring, you've got something about to be built over here, you've got a technology being researched, and you're kind of constantly kind of going around checking on how all these things are doing. And it's not that important where you are. You don't feel like you're at a place on the map, you know. This world feels like I might be a little more interested in kind of being down there on the ground, you know, doing things. And that leads to kind of another question. Choosing the system first or the topic? That's an interesting question, you know. You've kind of said we're going to use a civish approach to this world. That's one way of approaching it. But I might think of, okay, I want to bring prehistory to life with no preconceptions. You know, what game would I make in that case? You know, would it be 4X or would it take a different approach? You know, I think that's kind of a you know, going back thinking about how we approach pirates and games like that, it was kind of like, here's the topic, here are the cool things we want to happen. Let's find some systems, whether they're from RPG or action or whatever, to kind of bring that to life. And I think there's an opportunity here to maybe break out of the mold a little bit and think about how combat might work differently from Civ or you know, or whatever. And the other question that comes to mind here is the problem we had with the original Civ and continue to have through all the Civs. Where do you stop? How do you manage the complexity of the game? Because Civ is such a rich topic that we can easily overwhelm the player. And you've got kind of a lot of stuff going on here. And how do I, as the player, kind of keep a thread of a story in my mind that ties all these things together? I think that's kind of a challenge with all the different parts happening. There's a simplicity in Civ that all my legions are the same. So I have a legion model, and I know what legions do. If every unit is kind of different, then, you know, was that the guy that was good at bison riding, or was that the cow riding guy? You know, who's that guy? You know, as you cycle around the world, trying to keep all that stuff in your mind, I think that would be kind of an interesting challenge. So Civ manages to create almost an illusion of complexity by putting these simple systems together. And what's powerful about that is that the player owns those systems, understands them, and can project them into the future. And the more that your player is kind of playing the next turn and the turn after that, as opposed to the turn that they're currently on, the more that becomes very rich in their mind. And I think that you know, there's some very good examples of how you could create that here with the kind of projecting the migration of the herds and things like that. I think, but finding ways for the player to kind of be thinking in the future is a really powerful, I think, part of the Civ experience. But there's some really cool ideas.
I think what Sid's saying is that our game is terrible.
We're going to blame you guys, though.
I've never designed by committee. You should never do that.
Object lesson.
No, I think it's a really cool idea. Again, it's kind of like a lot of stuff we know how to do. I'm kind of, but my mind goes to, all right, what are the problems we'd have to solve to kind of make this all come together? And those are the things that strike me. Just going back a second, we did not define the X's before we originally designed Civ. They kind of came out of the process of again looking at the topic and saying, well, okay, here's a children's book. What are the things we know about the history of civilization? How do we bring them to life? And how do we make these kind of simple systems work together? Which is really a lesson we learned from Railroad Tycoon, how managing the railroad, running the railroad, operating the trains, buying and selling stock, all that stuff kind of individually was manageable, but things interacted in a very fascinating way that made every game different, and kind of Civ had that same quality with the map and things like that. I was a little concerned, I know I'm very picky, I'm sorry. A little concerned with the idea of the map changing when you weren't looking at it. Civ players are picky and sensitive. And
what do you think about the scalability? Like starting small and working your way to a larger map?
I think that's a bad idea.
Sorry,
Jake.
Noted.
It's hard enough to make one good game, and you're really making 2 or 3 good games at that point. So good luck with that.
All right.
It's funny, you're talking about like the Civish approach, which I must be amusing to you of all people to hear like people like us coming in 30 years later and saying, there's an approach now that you invented, whether you meant to or not. Versus like thinking about the premise of the game and saying, what is the game that makes that? Beyond Earth is a really good example. Like we designed a game that had both of those questions before it, and we definitely picked, deliberately so, the Civish approach, because we wanted the game to belong to the Civ, to the core Civilization franchise. And so we said, here's our premise. It's the future. It's humans settling another planet. What's the Civish approach? Answer that. Sitting here now, when you're saying that, thinking like, if we were just to take that topic alone, humans settling another planet with no preconceptions, what kind of game that would have been, or could be, is a very, very new thought bubble for me.
On the other hand, there's a lot of actually advantages of using the Civ model in the same way that back in the RTS day, we knew the conventions, we knew what right click did, what left click did, we kind of knew how things were going to work. In the same way that Civ,
simpler time.
What's that?
The happier, simpler time.
Yeah.
Or 2 buttons and that was
it. In the same way that you come to a topic with your preconceptions of what's cool about pirates or history or dinosaurs or railroads, whatever, I think you come to a Civ game with a lot of knowledge about how it works. You understand kind of what's going to be important, that's going to grow, that things are going to, you kind of know how to play before you start, which is an advantage to using the Civ model, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like when you made the original Civ, the genres were not as clearly defined in games, and now I think it's fallen into genres like movies have. You make a comedy, you make an action movie, et cetera, et cetera. And there's deviation from those things, but there are these conventions people understand and expect that you have to meet. Yeah. I think as Civ designers, particularly now, as we approached Civ, figuring out which conventions we wanted to meet expectation with, which ones we wanted to throw out, what we needed to change, how conservative we should be to the Civ 5 model versus changing the formula, has ramifications. Like, I wish we could design a game like that. Like, let's just, in a vacuum, design a game about space and all that. But there are things like tech considerations and expectation and marketing promotion. It's like, there's all of this stuff. Now, somehow, Sid, you have managed to avoid all that stuff in your career. How do you like, what's the black magic there that you get to make games in that headspace where you're not thinking about genre, you're not thinking about mechanics, it's just what the player's going to do and how they're going to do it?
Well, that's really where we started, I think. And when you look back at the history of Firaxis and before that Microprose, our games were kind of all over the map in terms of flight simulators and pirates and railroads and civilization and Covert Action, I'm actually plugging a session we'll be doing later today where we talk about all those games. But it was kind of this topic-first approach, I think. It's like, all right, here's the pirates. Okay, what's cool about pirates? There's got to be some sword fighting. There's got to be ship battles. There's got to be this finding treasure. Not trying to make that fit. We didn't have genres back in those days. I think that was a somewhat of a liberating thing. We didn't have to conform to a genre convention, so we could kind of make these games. And honestly, the bar in terms of graphics and things like that wasn't as high, so we could focus a lot of our energy on the gameplay and iterate and kind of, once we had a game that worked, we'd slap a little bit of graphics on it and ship it out there, and people would add their imagination, and it would be cool, So, and I think the stakes weren't as high, honestly, as they are today with the budgets and the cost of games. So, again, talking later on today about the good old days of game design, but there's still, I think we're in a world actually with indie, et cetera, where there's still those kind of opportunities, but they're kind of done at a different scale.
All right, so one more question with our seconds remaining. Based on what you've seen today, would you greenlight this project to go forward and develop Dawn of Civ, Civ Doc?
Based on the title alone, yes. I love that. I love that title.
That's 90% of game design, is just naming stuff. All right, thank you so much.
Thank
Sid
you.
Meier, everybody.
And thank all of you for participating here in this experiment. Hopefully we'll get to do this again. Dave, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys for coming to Firaxicon. This is awesome. And we'll see you next year.
Take care. Or not.